Welcome back to Razor's Edge Wrestling Mind Training. If you're new to the channel, my name's Coach English. I'm an Air Force veteran and Division I wrestler, a championship coach, a published author, and a teacher of nearly 2 decades. And I'm passionate about 2 things. Those are high-level wrestling and the inner workings of the human mind. And so that's what I do on this channel is I take short clips and interviews of wrestling's greatest minds, and I break them down so that you can implement and use those techniques and strategies in order to take your wrestling game to the highest level possible. If you think this video can help your wrestling game in any way, I encourage you to take a look at my mind training course. You can find it at the address listed above, which is rewmindtraining.com. Also, I'm going to link 2 previews that will cover exactly what's in my mind training course. The first video is a short preview, and the second one is a longer version if you'd like a longer explanation into what I do and how I can help you through my mind training course. And let's face it, guys, when it comes to this mind training stuff, it holds the key to taking a wrestler from being pretty good to being one of the best. We all know for a fact that wrestlers work extremely hard. As I've mentioned before, I was a Division I wrestler, and as a D1 wrestler, I worked as hard as I believe was humanly possible physically. We did 6 a.m. lifts, buddy carries upstairs, and had 2-hour-long practices where we didn't stop working from beginning to end. I mean, Olympian Cary Kolat was one of my coaches while at Lock Haven, and the reason I mention this is because we had a room full of savages. I remember thinking to myself, how is Iowa working any harder than we are right now? Or how is Penn State, doing more work than Lock Haven? And now after many years, I realize they weren't working any harder than us physically, but they also spent a significant amount of time working on their mind game. And I know that personally, that was an area in which I was lacking for the most part, and so were my teammates. And so today I'm going to break down a 2-minute interview with renowned coach Cael Sanderson, and I've identified 3 key takeaways in just this short video that if you can implement these into your wrestling game, they can help you get more victories and take your wrestling game to the next level. Now, before I get into the breakdown, I want to point out 2 very important things about Cael Sanderson. The first thing is that Cael is extremely intelligent, and the second thing, he's highly competitive. And this is evident by the facts that he was arguably the greatest wrestler in U.S. history, and also he's built the greatest wrestling dynasty the U.S. has ever seen. And the reason I mention this is because I've seen people post things in the comment section where they'll say things like, I wish Cael would talk more, or I wish Cael was more vocal. And I bring this to you because obviously as the head coach of the greatest college wrestling team in the country, he has media obligations. And he's put in front of the camera a lot, but he really doesn't reveal too much, and who can blame him? I mean, imagine that you've spent your life to build an empire, and everyone is looking at you to see what you're doing so they can try to emulate your level of success. You're not just going to go out and start blasting the world all your secrets about what you're doing, but like I said, there are some clips and interviews out there that if you know what you're looking for, you can sort of read between the lines and figure out how Penn State is teaching their athletes to train their minds. And it actually has a lot to do with a little old lady that you can see a lot of times on the bench. But as for now, let's focus on this video, and I will reveal to you 3 key takeaways that you can utilize to take your wrestling game to the next level. So let's get into it.
And as a top coach, what do you think we can do for the sport to make it more appealing to the mass media?
Well, we need heroes. I think people will follow heroes, and however you do that, I don't know. I think you gotta create stories, and that's tell stories. And I think one example that comes to mind is just I think the Olympics in general weren't as popular on TV as they were until they started really putting time into telling the individual stories. And as soon as people can get to know who they're watching, and then they'll follow them. So we need to do that in wrestling. How do we do that? I don't know. I mean, you got a Jordan Burroughs, guys that can span outside of just our sport, and we got to tell that story and make sure everybody knows what's going on. Because anybody is very respectful of a wrestler. You just people know enough that if they know you're a wrestler, they know you know what it takes to be successful. Yeah. It's just a matter of getting that story out there. And I think it's just, again, it comes down to progress. We need to make sure we're building at the bottom. My mentality is we got to build up from the bottom, and it's not necessarily, the shuffling around at the top that's going to make the difference. It's getting numbers.
Okay, so the first takeaway I want to discuss is here Cael mentions the need for heroes and stories. Now he's talking in regards to how we grow the sport of wrestling, right? So if you've ever watched any documentaries from NFL films, you'll understand what he's talking about. The NFL does a great job of promoting heroes and legends of the sport with people like, let's say, Barry Sanders. And if you've ever seen these biographical films, they talk about the life struggles that these athletes have overcome throughout their lives in order to achieve greatness. But what this has to do with you is there's a need for us as wrestlers to have heroes in our lives. But I don't necessarily call them heroes, although they are. I refer to them rather as role models. And I talk about this in my mind training course. But the reason we need these role models is because it sets the standard for what we want to emulate and achieve ourselves. It gives us people to look up to. These role models not only teach us and show us what is possible, but it also shows us the path on how to achieve greatness. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, I had a number of heroes and role models growing up, from guys like Mike Tyson to Bruce Lee, and there were also a lot of great wrestlers that I looked up to, and just the one in particular that stands out in my mind was the wrestling phenom, Cary Kolat. Now, I came up in the 90s, and anyone out there who's old enough to remember will remember how big of a superstar Kolat was. I mean, this guy was larger than life. I did make a short video about him a while back, but we're talking about a high school kid who had an article written about him in Sports Illustrated. This guy had a Nike shoe deal way before wrestling even came close to being mainstream. But the coolest thing about Cary Kolat was that he was like an urban legend. I first heard about him in middle school when our coach would talk to us before practice, and he would be trying to motivate us. And I mean, this coach was way ahead of his time with this stuff, but he would tell us stories about this high school kid from Jefferson, Morgan, who was entering the toughest college wrestling tournaments in the country and actually winning. I mean, Kolat was knocking off NCAA finalists as a high school sophomore. He even took a current U.S. Olympian into overtime, and I believe he lost 1-0 on a penalty point. And, again, this was all in his sophomore year of high school. Again, I think he was doing this stuff his junior year of high school. I mean, he had these aspirations for greatness before he had even graduated. I mean, he's talking Olympic level competition, as a high school kid. But it wasn't only that it was the stories of legend that were matriculating throughout the wrestling world. Just a quick one off the top of my head, I remember hearing a story about how Kolat was doing 1,000 push-ups a day. I mean, there would be stories like this in the newspaper, and then, obviously just in the wrestling community, there's a lot of stories that get passed around word of mouth. This was before the days of social media and, 24/7 news outlets and Flow Wrestling and all the stuff that we have today. And as I'd previously mentioned, I was fortunate enough to have my hero, Cary Kolat, as a wrestling coach when I walked on at Lock Haven. And I don't know if I manifested that or what, but I was able to pick his brain, when guys after practice, they would, sit around and sweat against the wall and talk and stuff like that. And, I would kind of make my way over to where he was. And, I got to admit, I was a little intimidated by him because he was just this larger than life figure in my mind. But, sometimes I would get up the nerve to go over and sit down beside. I mean, I watched this guy constantly in practice because he was still going live. I mean, he was, he'd find the best guy in the room and he would drill with them, and then they'd go live and stuff like that. And it was just a lot of fun to watch. But, I would find my way over to him at the end of practice, and I would actually, pick his brain a little bit, like I said, and I would get firsthand accounts on some of the stories I'd heard about him and the legends. And, it was just such an amazing experience to even just be in the same room as that guy. And by the way, Coach Kolat, he's an amazing guy. He's just really down to earth. People that big of a status, sometimes you're not sure how they're going to be in person, but, he was just always very approachable, never had an attitude that made you feel like you shouldn't be talking to him. I mean, he was always very welcoming, But like I said, he's still very active in the wrestling world. He's still putting out content. I encourage you to look him up. And I mean, the guy still looks like he could still wrestle. But there were many reasons why having Kolat as one of my role models was so important. And one of those reasons was that it motivated me to take my wrestling and training to a higher level. I mean, think about it. As a young wrestler, you're hearing all these amazing stories about this guy who just so happens to wrestle in the same state as you, and all the crazy training he's doing, and how he's so motivated to get better and challenge himself. And, you know, now he's entering high-level college tournaments and actually winning. I mean, that was tremendously inspiring to a young wrestler. And not only the competitions, but also the stories about his training, you know. So when I was training, I was thinking about all that stuff, and what Kolat was doing as a role model was he was laying the blueprint on how to become one of the greatest wrestlers in the world, and showing young guys like me, you know, here's what you need to do to get to the level that maybe you're aspiring to get to. And so that's another tremendous advantage to having role models, is that since they've already achieved the things that you're inspired to do, you can learn from them and adopt those same training methods that they use to, you know, achieve greatness. And so again, I elaborate a bit more on this in my mind training course, so you may want to check that out. But I encourage you to put some effort in finding the best role models and use them as motivation, and also as a model for what you need to do in order to become the savage that you aspire to be. And again, there's so many people out there today, whether it's Carter Starachi or you know, Gable Steveson, or I mean, you know, obviously the list goes on and on. You know, pick your favorite guy and, you know, try to follow them on social media and see what types of training they're doing, and just, you know, whatever it is that's making them great, that can inspire you, find it and use it. Utilize it, guys. The knowledge is out there. The content is out there today. And in this interview, Cael mentions the need for storylines as well. Now, Cael mentions this along with the need for heroes and in terms of growing the sport. But however, there is another part to this whole story philosophy. But in the case that I'm referring to, I'm talking about personal stories, or your personal story. And your personal story is closely aligned with your self-image. And I don't have time to get into it much today, but one thing I do want to mention and emphasize is that you cannot outperform your self-image. And because of this fact, I've dedicated an entire section of my mind training course to developing a bulletproof self-image. And because of the absolute necessity of developing a bulletproof self-image, I put it at the beginning of the course. So again, if you're interested, I encourage you to check that out as well. All right, so let's move on.
And in one sentence, and this is my last question, when you're up there on your 4th NCAA title, or you're up there for the gold, for the Olympic gold, are you ever scared, or what are you feeling
When you're about to compete?
Yeah, when you personally, you know.
Well, yeah, I think fear is not. I mean, you obviously, you better be nervous. You know, I mean, that's a gift from God. You know, it helps you run a little faster and jump a little higher. So you're definitely nervous, but it's more. You got to look at it more as being spirited. You know, I mean, you're. I don't bet, go to racetracks, but you say they bet on the horse that looks acting a little bit more spirited than the rest. So it's a positive thing, but it's.
Okay, so key takeaway number 2, and this is in regards to the reporter asking Cael if he ever experienced fear when he competed. But first, I want to focus on the statement that Cael makes at the end of this clip, which is, he says, it's a positive thing, right? And I quote, it's a positive thing. And I know most people's response to that is, wait, did he say fear is a positive thing? And what we have to realize is that this is a big part of the Penn State philosophy, which is called frame control. Right? Frame control. And what I mean when I talk about frame control, or that you should always control your frame, which is referring to your frame of mind, or some call it a state of mind. But Penn State never frames anything in a negative light. It's always about taking whatever the situation is and framing it in a positive, or in other words, an optimistic light. And again, I talk about this a lot in my mind training course, and if you're interested, I did a video a while back about Iowa great Cary Brands. This is on my YouTube channel if you want to find it. Maybe I'll try to link it in here. But he framed exhaustion in a wrestling match to make it something positive, and this is a method along the same lines. At the beginning of his answer, Cael also says it's a gift from God, right? Again, this is an example of frame control. Cael's initial response was to take something that the majority of people would categorize as negative and put it into a positive frame. And the really cool thing about this is you can tell this is how Cael has trained his mind, right? It's just like anything else. Like, the more you do it, the more it becomes your new norm, right? And I guarantee you this is how he has trained his athletes' minds as well, because again, when I watch these interviews with his athletes, they kind of repeat some of these same types of phrases, and you can see the mind training, being expressed in their interviews. And this is what they do. This is part of the culture. This is part of the the training that Cael has brought to Penn State. But like I said, you see, training your mind is just like training your body. An example is a double leg takedown. A veteran wrestler who's trained for a number of years no longer has to give conscious effort to shooting a double leg. Rather, it's built into his muscle memory, right? It's so automatic that he can shoot a double without even thinking about it. He doesn't have to pause to remember where to put his hands and feet. And the same can be said for training the mind. An athlete like Cael, or again, some of his athletes like Carter Starachi, they don't have to put a lot of conscious effort into frame control, because after, a few weeks, months, maybe years of training one's mind, it becomes effortless. Your mind automatically thinks in terms of optimism. Everything is framed in a positive light. The problem is that most people just unknowingly have kind of conditioned their minds to think in a negative light, right? Or have a negative frame. And so they're always kind of thinking of whatever challenge it might be. It automatically is kind of put into that negative frame. And it's that just becomes our automatic response. Whereas, framing things in an optimistic light or a positive light, that then becomes just automatic to you after you start to use these types of techniques. And so one thing to remember is that it's all about framing things in a positive light, and fear is no different. So Cael's answer to the question of saying he says, you better be nervous, right? And what he's referring to here is that before a competition, there's going to be a heightened sense of energy. And again, this is your body's natural way of preparing for a highly anticipated event, right? This is your body's way of preparing for competition. Or, the same could be said if you were just walking through the woods and you heard a stick break. I mean, all of a sudden your senses become heightened, right? Your heart rate jumps. You start looking around, right? Your eyes start to become more acute. And that's a natural response. And so if I were to ask you, describe how you feel before a wrestling match, you might answer, well, my heart rate goes up, my palms get a little sweaty, I seem to become hyper aware, right? My hearing and my eyesight become super sensitive. And in reality, those are all very common characteristics, physical characteristics of what happens, right? But it's not about whether or not those types of things are happening. Because, of course, that's your body's fight or flight mechanism kicking in, right? That's natural. That's normal. That's good, like Cael says. But where the difference between the common wrestler and a wrestler who's trained his mind comes in is in how that energy and those physical responses are filtered through your brain, or in other words, in how you frame that energy and those responses, right? So again, it's about putting it back into that positive frame, or, frame control, positive frame of mind. And what you can do is when you start to feel that elevated heart rate and heightened sense of awareness, instead of putting that through your brain filter and allowing it to translate as fear, you embrace that energy and filter it through your brain as just being excited, right? So instead of thinking oh no, I'm feeling scared, I'm nervous, this is bad, why am I sweating? Why is my heart rate up? Uh-oh, I must be scared. You'd rather say this is great, man. Oh, I'm feeling excited. Or in Cael's words, spirited, right? He says he calls it spirited. So he doesn't call it being afraid or being fearful or anything like that. He's rephrasing it and reframing it, I should say, as being spirited. And he uses the racehorse as an example, right? He said the spirited horse is going to be the one that runs faster. And so a lot of times you're going to put your money on that horse because it's alert, it's ready to go. Right? Whereas if, think about this, before a wrestling match, you don't want to be too relaxed. You don't want to be too calm, because you're not going to perform your best if you're super relaxed and super calm. You want your body you want that heart rate up, right? You want your body to be prepared. You want to be hyper aware. So framing this energy and physical response as excited and spirited instead of scared and nervous, you've now changed your frame from one of negativity to one of positivity. And now a wrestling match becomes something to get excited about. And that heightened heart rate becomes a good thing, right? Meaning you're ready to compete instead of feeling, dread because you're interpreting that heart rate and energy as something based in fear. And it really is that simple, guys. The thing about it is that most people don't know how to make this transition mentally. And so therefore most people feel really scared or nervous or whatever you want to call it until the ref blows the whistle, and then as we know, the nerves go away and now you're kind of like, on autopilot, if you will. But imagine feeling excited before a wrestling match, like as if you're, getting ready to go on a fishing trip, or, maybe you're getting ready to go on a trip to Disney, where you can barely sleep at night because you're looking forward to it so much. All of a sudden, the sport gets more fun, and guess what? What else happens? You perform better. As Cael states, you run a little faster, you jump a little higher. As a matter of fact, you better pray for that heightened sense of awareness before a match, because that's going to allow you to perform at an optimal level.
For me, it was just, you just got to stay focused on what you can control, and that's what you're going to do with that's your attitude and your effort.
Absolutely.
But in this last short clip, Cael states, and I quote, "For me, it's all about staying focused on what you can control." And again, I love hearing Cael say these things because this is something I talk about in my course, which is focusing on what you can control and then letting go of the rest. So first, let's take a look at some things that are out of your control. Things such as your wrestling environment. I know personally there have been times where certain variables were not ideal for a wrestling match. One time I remember in particular when I was a coach, you could feel a stiff breeze, cold breeze blowing from the vent that was hitting directly on our bench, enough to the point where another one of the coaches came over and said something about it, and we sort of joked around and said that it was an intentional tactic by our opponents to take us out of our game, because we were in an away match. And I don't know if that was true, but regardless, although it was a small inconvenience, it was still something that was out of our control. So we just kind of put it out of our heads and ignored it. But one major thing that is out of our control that's a big part of the sport is the ref. I remember my dad used to say, sometimes you got to beat the ref too. And one thing I need to mention is that when the ref makes a bad call, most of the times it's not intentional. And we have to keep in mind the potential for human error. I firmly believe that most times the refs try to do their best to make the right call, but mistakes do happen. And, we've all seen this occur, and I've seen some guys and even coaches where they just started flipping out and losing their minds because they weren't given a takedown or because they wanted a stall call against their opponent or whatever it is. And I realize that a blown call is extremely frustrating, especially if it affects the outcome of the match. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes it happens, and rather than lose control and start yelling or throwing a fit or whatever, you need to put it out of your mind and focus on what you can control. And again, I reiterate, since this is something that is out of your control, you cannot afford to let it take your mind out of the game. Rather, you need to let it go, move forward, and stay focused on the task at hand. And this brings me to my last point.
So, for me, it was just, you just got to stay focused on what you can control, and that's what you're going to do with that's your attitude and your effort.
And with that, I'll elaborate on Cael's last point, which is when he states the two things which you are in control of, and they are, and I quote, your effort and your attitude. And again, I've heard this mentioned a number of times in interviews with Penn State athletes, which is a reflection of the fact that this is something that Cael and his staff talk to their guys about a lot. And so your effort, only you can control the amount of effort that you're putting into the sport, right? And I know a lot of you out there agree with me when I say that that's one of the greatest aspects of our sport, is that it rewards hard work, maybe more so than any other sport. When you compare wrestling with other sports such as basketball, where it favors you to be tall, or football, where it favors you to be big or fast, one of the biggest determining factors in wrestling is whether or not you're willing to put in the effort, the work, right? And it's about how hard you're working and pushing yourself in training, and then also how hard you're working in a match. And again, I think this is one of the reasons I've always loved wrestling so much, is because it's fair. I've always felt like if the outcome of my match is going to be determined by who works harder or who wants it more, then I'm going to come out on top. And that should be the way you think. That's why wrestlers live by the creed, embrace the grind. We love the grind. We love the sweat. We love the battle. We love to work hard, and if you're doing those things, then a lot of times you're going to be successful on the mat. And then the final point that I will elaborate on is Cael's final quote, which is your attitude. And this might be the most important takeaway from the clip, because sometimes this is the hardest thing to control for some people. Wrestling really is such a tough sport, and it is such a grind that sometimes it's tough to maintain the right attitude. But this is also the reason why it's so important. You know, when you're cutting weight or you're tired, it's easy to get down on yourself, and that negative voice in your head tends to get a little louder and the volume gets turned up. But, you know, like Cael says, you are in control of your attitude. It's one of the only things you're in control of. And one of my coaches at Lock Haven, Mike Rogers, he used to yell at us in practice, stop feeling sorry for yourself. And this is exactly what he was talking about. You know, I promise that if you can control your attitude and maintain an attitude of gratitude and optimism, your success on the mat will increase dramatically. And another benefit is that you will bounce back from setbacks easier. And there are techniques and strategies that you can utilize to help you maintain that positive attitude that Cael is speaking of here. But if I go into all the techniques that I could teach, we'd be here for another 2 hours. Just a quick recap of the 3 key takeaways from Cael Sanderson and Penn State Wrestling. Key takeaway number 1, Cael discussed the importance of heroes, or as I like to refer to them, role models. We discussed the importance of role models and how they can help us take our wrestling to the next level. Key takeaway number 2, Cael mentions the importance of frame control, and here I elaborated on the importance of framing everything in a positive or optimistic light. Here we use the example of Cael reframing fear as spirited, and he calls it a blessing from God. I also discussed the importance of training your mind so that you automatically see challenges in an optimistic frame. Cael also mentions focusing on what you can control and forgetting the rest. And then, key takeaway number 3, this takeaway was a continuation of number 2, which Cael discusses 2 things that you are in control of, which are your effort and your attitude. And I went on to discuss the absolute necessity of training your mind to maintain control of those 2 things. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out my course. And also there's some more videos posted on my YouTube channel that you can check out if you're interested. But as for now, I'm going to wrap it up. I hope you found this video useful. This is Coach English with Razor's Edge Mind Training. Until next time, stay sharp.